The Ghost in the Machine Part 1. The Woman with No Name. The first thing you notice is the sound, not the alarms, those come later. What you notice first in those final quiet seconds before everything breaks is the hum. A deep, resonant, almost living hum that fills the bones of the building the way a cathedral fills with silence between prayers. It is the sound of 10,000 servers running in perfect unison, the sound of cooling systems pulling heat from processors that think faster than any human mind. It is the sound of controlled power and inside Naval Surface Warfare Center Dahlgren on a gray Tuesday morning in March 2020. It is the only sound that matters. LC. One, Cerberus does not look like a place where wars are fought. From the outside, it is just another low concrete structure on the western bank of the Potomac, unremarkable against the flat Virginia sky. But inside, in the cold blue light of the command deck, the wars of the 21st century are rehearsed and refought every single day. Holographic fleet maps stretch across the central display. Data streams scroll in columns of green and gold. The digital ghosts of carrier strike groups move through simulated ocean corridors, responding to threats that do not yet exist, preparing for battles that no one hopes will ever be real. This is the heart of American naval cyber warfare. And on this particular Tuesday morning, 3 minutes before everything changes, a woman no one recognizes is standing very still beside the primary command node. She is not tall, 5'4", maybe 120 pounds in her civilian clothes. Dark slacks, a plain gray quarter-zip pullover, the kind of outfit that makes a person invisible in an office, invisible in a hallway, invisible on a command deck where every other person is in uniform. She carries no rank, no insignia, no name badge. Just a battered leather notebook tucked under her left arm and a tablet held loosely in her right hand, its screen dark. Her eyes are light gray. They move slowly across the room, taking in each console, each display, each data stream, with the calm, deliberate attention of someone reading a book they have read before. Not searching, cataloging. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Nobody looks at her. That is about to change. Warren Cross spent 14 months building Cerberus. He worked in this building when it was still unfinished, when the server racks were empty aluminum frames and the floor cables lay coiled like sleeping snakes. He worked nights in a folding chair with a space heater at his feet and a thermos of black coffee going cold on the floor beside him. He had been refused additional budget 3 times. He had been told the project was too ambitious, too theoretical, too expensive for what it promised to deliver. He had been told this by men with more stars than him, men with bigger offices and louder voices, and he had listened to all of it with the same quiet expression and then gone back to his desk and continued writing code. Rear Admiral Warren Cross was not the kind of man who announced himself. He had the bearing of someone who had learned early and at some cost that the people who talk the most in a room are almost never the ones who know the most. He spoke when he had something to say. He listened the rest of the time. He had served 31 years in the United States. Navy had overseen systems architecture for 3 generations of naval cyber infrastructure and had come to believe with the settled certainty of a man who has tested his beliefs against reality for a long time that the most dangerous word in any technical system is the word assumption. He built Cerberus on that belief. Every line of foundational code carried it. Every failsafe, every redundancy, every buried maintenance protocol was designed around the premise that someone someday would assume the system was safer than it was, and that when that day came, the system needed to be able to save itself. He did not live to see whether he was right. In July of 2016, Warren Cross was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He died 11 weeks later. He was 62 years old. He left behind a wife named Catherine, a 30-year collection of technical journals, and a daughter named Daria, who was 23 years old and had just started her first year of doctoral study in computer science at MIT, and who stood at his graveside in the August heat at Arlington National Cemetery and did not cry because crying was something she planned to do later in private where no one could see her be anything less than what he had raised her to be. He had made her promise 2 things in his final weeks. The first promise was to her mother. It was simple and practical and carried the weight of what he could not say directly. Come home safe. Whatever you do, wherever the work takes you, come home safe. The second promise was different. He made her look at him when he asked for it. She was sitting in the chair beside his hospital bed, the notebook open on her knee, the same notebook she always brought, the battered leather one she had started using when she was 15, and he began teaching her systems architecture, the way other fathers teach their daughters to drive, and he waited until she looked up from the page before he spoke. "You are better at this than I ever was," he said. His voice was already thin by then. "That is not a compliment. That is a warning. Because the people who are best at this kind of work, they get pulled into rooms where the stakes are so high that they forget they had a life before the room. I watched it happen to men smarter than me. I do not want that for you." She started to argue. He shook his head. "Promise me you will walk away from it, do the research, finish the degree, but the operational work, leave that to someone else." She promised. She had been keeping that promise for 3.5 years when she drove through the gate at Dahlgren on a Tuesday morning in March and showed her civilian contractor badge to the guard and parked in the visitor lot and walked toward LC-1 Cerberus with her father's notebook under her arm. Chief Doyle Herrick had been stationed at Dahlgren for 6 years. Before that, he had served on destroyers and one amphibious assault ship and had done a rotation at Fleet Cyber Command in Fort Meade that he did not discuss with people who had not held the same clearance level. He was 58 years old, built like a man who had spent 3 decades doing physical work and expected to spend several more with gray at his temples and a face that had been weathered into something close to impassiveness. He expressed strong feelings through very small movements, a slight tension around the jaw, a fractional narrowing of the eyes. If you had not been watching him for a longer time, you would miss it entirely. He had watched Warren Cross work in this building in the early days of Cerberus, had brought him coffee twice when the Admiral's own thermos ran empty, an act of pure logistical practicality that Cross had acknowledged with a single nod, the nod of a man who notices things and files them without ceremony. In 1994, on a destroyer running night operations in the North Atlantic, Cross had spent 40 minutes one evening showing a young petty officer, third class, named Doyle Herrick, how to read a system failure before it became a cascade, how to see it in the data before the alarm started, how to distinguish between a problem and a symptom, which are almost never the same thing. Herrick had never forgotten that lesson. He had used some version of it nearly every week of his professional life since. He was standing near the aft entrance of the command deck on Tuesday morning when the woman in the gray pullover walked in. He noted her the way he noted everything, without apparent interest, without reaction, with the peripheral and comprehensive attention that long experience makes automatic. He noted the notebook. He noted the tablet. He noted the way she moved to the primary command node and stopped not randomly but precisely at the spot that would give her the widest unobstructed sightline across the full array of display screens. He noted that she had not checked in at the security desk. He did not move. He watched. At 7:43 in the morning, the woman's right hand moved to her tablet. She studied it for 4 seconds, then looked at the secondary diagnostic display to her left, then back at the tablet. Then she reached out and tapped a sequence of commands on a terminal panel that did not belong to her, that she should not have been able to access. The sequence lasted approximately 7 seconds. On the secondary diagnostic display, a small amber warning indicator, the kind that precedes a cascade notification by approximately 90 minutes if left unaddressed, blinked once and disappeared. No alarm sounded. No one looked up from their stations. The amber light was gone before it had been there long enough for anyone to register it consciously. Herrick registered it. He looked at the woman. She had already returned her attention to the tablet, her expression unchanged. Then he looked at the terminal she had touched, and then back at her, and something moved through Doyle Herrick's face that was too small and too quick for anyone across the room to catch. A slight parting of the lips, the beginning of a breath that did not quite become speech. He had seen this before. Not this exact sequence, not this specific correction, but the motion of it, the angle of assessment, the quality of the attention, the precise economy of the intervention. He had seen all of this in a man who once sat on a destroyer's deck, plating for 2 hours to find the source of a failure that everyone else was trying to fix from the top down. He looked at what she was carrying under her arm. The notebook was old. The leather was dark at the corners, the spine cracked and reinforced with a strip of electrical tape along the bottom edge. He could not read the cover from where he stood, but the shape of it, the dimensions, the specific repair at the base of the spine. Herrick looked away. He put both hands in his pockets. His jaw was tight. He did not reach for his radio. Captain Garrett Oakes arrived at LC-1 Cerberus at 7:51, which was 4 minutes later than his scheduled arrival, and a fact that no one on the command deck was foolish enough to mention. He was 52 years old, 6'2", with the straight-backed physical authority of a man who had been given command of rooms for long enough that he had stopped distinguishing between rooms he commanded and rooms he merely occupied. He wore his uniform the way some men wear armor, not as protection, but as declaration. His record was legitimate. 2 prior commands, a graduate degree from the Naval War College, a reputation for operational precision that was genuinely earned. He was not stupid. He was something more dangerous than stupid. He was competent within the boundaries of what he knew and completely unaware that those boundaries existed. He entered the command deck and the room adjusted itself. Voices dropped half a register. Postures straightened. The ambient energy of the space reorganized around him the way it reorganizes around any figure with institutional authority, the social gravity of rank pulling everything slightly in his direction. He went through the morning brief with his senior staff current simulation parameters, overnight diagnostic results, the status of 3 software updates running behind schedule. He spoke with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to being the most informed person present, which he usually was within the territory he had mapped. He had been on the command deck for 11 minutes before he saw the woman. She had not moved. She was still standing beside the primary command node in her gray pullover, still holding her tablet, still reading with that unhurried focus. In a room full of uniformed personnel, she was the most visually incongruous element by a considerable margin, and it took him 11 minutes to notice her, which said something specific about the direction of his attention. When he did notice, he stopped mid-sentence. Ensign Beckett Harlow, 23 years old and 8 months out of Annapolis, was standing close enough to hear what happened next. He was a lean young man with the slightly stunned alertness of someone still in the process of understanding what he had agreed to by joining the Navy. He was attentive in the way of people who have not yet learned which things are safe to ignore, meaning he was attentive to everything, which made him unusual in a room where most people's attention had been organized into specific channels by years of habit. Harlow watched Oakes look at the woman. He watched the captain's expression cycle through surprise, assessment, and irritation in approximately 2 seconds. "Ma'am," Oakes said. His voice carried across the deck the way a ship's horn carries across water, designed for distance, calibrated to cut. "This is a restricted area. I need you to identify yourself and your purpose on this deck." The woman did not look up from her tablet. The room did not quite go silent, but it went careful. The particular careful of people who have decided not to be involved while being absolutely unable to look away. Oakes waited 4 seconds. Then he said it again, and this time the volume increased, and something else entered the voice, a quality that had ended arguments on multiple ships across multiple years, a quality built from the accumulated authority of a long career and the specific belief that authority once deployed is always answered. The woman turned a page in her notebook. Harlow later said it was the notebook that broke something in Oakes. Not her silence, not her stillness, not even the civilian clothes. It was the act of writing in it, or rather of reading it, of consulting it as a relevant document in a room where the only relevant documents were supposed to be the official ones. The gesture was so completely disconnected from any deference to the room or the man addressing her that it became without intending to be its own statement. Oakes crossed the deck in 8 strides. He stopped 2 feet from the woman and looked down at her, the full physical and institutional weight of the moment organized in his posture, in the angle of his chin, in the simple geometry of his size relative to hers. "I gave you a lawful order," he said. His voice was low now, which was more effective than loud, and he knew it. "Identify yourself, now." She looked up. Her eyes were the color of fog over the Potomac in winter. They held his without effort, without defiance, without any of the social accommodations that eyes usually make when they meet the eyes of authority. They were simply present, observing, as if the question of who held power in this room was not interesting to her because she already knew the answer, and the answer was not what he thought it was. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked back at her tablet. What happened next happened quickly. Oakes reached out and took her arm, not with the precision of a measured response, but with the blunt, decisive force of a man whose patience had run out and who had spent a career in environments where physical directness was a legitimate resolution to noncompliance. He turned her using his height and his momentum and pressed her back against the cold steel of the server rack bulkhead. The sound was soft, the weight of a person meeting a fixed surface. But in the suddenly total silence of the command deck, it landed like a struck bell. The laughter that had been building in the junior staff died before it formed. Herrick's jaw went tight. He did not move. Harlow stopped breathing for a moment. Oakes leaned in close enough that his voice was meant for her alone, though the room heard every word. "Last time, identify yourself and your purpose, or I will have you in the brig before you can say another word." She had not dropped her tablet. Her left hand still held it grip unchanged. In the 3 seconds before she responded, something shifted in the room that no one could quite name afterward. Not a change in sound or light or temperature. More like a shift in weight distribution, the way a ship moves when its center of gravity migrates without any visible cause. Herrick took one step closer. Not to intervene, to see her screen. He could read it now. The document was not a schematic, not a standard system diagnostic. It was a technical report. 47 pages single-spaced with a cover sheet that Herrick could read from 6 feet because the font was large and the language was precise. Protocol Omega Recursive Failure Vulnerability Assessment and Remediation Proposal. Date September 14, 2019. Author D. Cross, MS, MIT, Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. Doctoral candidate year 3. And at the bottom of the cover sheet in a section labeled Command Review, there was a signature. A date, and 4 words stamped in red ink. Non-priority, file and close. The signature below those words belonged to Captain Garrett Oakes. Herrick looked at the woman. He looked at her face, the set of the jaw, the gray eyes, the way she had not flinched when 210 pounds of institutional authority pressed her against a steel wall. He looked at the notebook tucked under her left arm, the battered leather spine reinforced with electrical tape, at the base the particular repair he had seen on the desk of a man who worked alone in the dark for 14 months building something that would outlive him. He had seen that notebook in the hands of Warren Cross. The understanding arrived in Herrick not as a surprise but as a confirmation, the recognition of something he had suspected since the moment she walked onto the deck. His face showed nothing, but his right hand moved slowly to the radio clipped at his belt and then stopped. Not yet. Whatever was about to happen needed to happen on its own terms. He had spent 37 years learning the difference between situations that required intervention and situations that required witness. This was the second kind. The woman's eyes finally lifted from the tablet. She looked at Oakes and she spoke. The words were quiet and stripped of everything: anger, fear, satisfaction, performance. They reached every person on the command deck the way a stone reaches the bottom of a well. Not loud, just final. Sir, she said, you might want to check your primary display. Oakes blinked. He turned. On the main holographic display that dominated the center of the command deck, a single line of crimson code had appeared in the field of blue and green data. One small anomaly in a calm sea, then another line, then 3 more in rapid succession. And then the screens began to change, and the ambient hum of the Cerberus facility changed with them, and from somewhere deep in the building's infrastructure, a sound began, low at first, almost subsonic, the sound of a system beginning to speak in a language no one in the room had been trained to hear. No one except the woman standing against the wall with her father's handwriting on every page of the notebook under her arm. The alarms came next. Part 2. Protocol Omega. By the time the second alarm joined the first, the command deck had already reorganized itself around the crisis. Not towards solving it, toward managing the appearance of solving it, which is a different thing entirely. And in rooms like this one, the difference is everything. Oakes was at the primary console. His hands were moving. The console was not responding. That gap between the motion and the result was the most honest thing in the room. The synthesized voice came from the overhead speakers with the calm of something that had no stake in the outcome. System integrity compromised. Protocol Omega engaged. All command functions locked. The cascade was not subtle. It moved through the Cerberus architecture, the way fire moves through a structure whose load-bearing elements have been compromised, not consuming everything at once, but removing one by one the supports that allowed everything else to stand. The holographic display at the center of the command deck dissolved mid-simulation. The blue water engagement scenario, the carrier strike groups in their contested ocean corridors, the data streams in blue and gold, all of it collapsed into a storm of red static, a visual analog of a system that had turned inward on itself. The ceiling lights cycled through 2 flickers and shifted from operational white to emergency amber, casting the command deck in the color of old photographs in late afternoons before storms. Report, Oakes said. His voice was still controlled. That discipline would last him another 3 minutes. Ensign Beckett Harlow was already at the nearest console, his hands moving with the urgent imprecision of someone trying to do in 10 seconds what normally required 30. Sir, I cannot. The system is not responding. Primary control is locked out. All simulated fleet assets are offline. It is the entire network. Override it. I am trying, sir. It is not. Protocol Omega was not a drill condition. It did not appear in the standard operating parameters that Oakes reviewed in his weekly command briefings. It was a theoretical failsafe designed for catastrophic scenarios so severe that its creators had hoped it would never be needed and had therefore never fully tested it against live operational conditions. In the event of a genuine external cyber intrusion, Protocol Omega was designed to sever all of Cerberus's external connections simultaneously, a total digital quarantine, a hard wall between the facility and whatever was attacking it. What no one in the room had yet understood was what happened when Protocol Omega activated against a false positive. What happened when the recursive logic at its core, designed to identify and respond to threats, encountered a data pattern that matched its threat parameters without actually constituting a threat. What happened when a system built to protect itself began to mistake its own signals for an attack. It began responding to itself, and each response compounded the one before it. The synthesized voice returned. Containment field breach detected. Core coolant systems entering emergency shutdown. Facility evacuation recommended. 12 minutes to critical threshold. 12 minutes. The number traveled through the room differently than the alarms had. Alarms create urgency. Numbers create understanding. Everyone on the command deck knew what the core coolant systems regulated. Cerberus ran on quantum processing architecture that operated at temperatures requiring continuous liquid helium circulation. Without active cooling, the thermal load would reach critical threshold inside the time frame the synthesized voice had just specified. And Protocol Omega, in its locked and self-compounding state, was interpreting the facility's own emergency response signals as evidence of ongoing attack, which caused it to escalate, which generated more signals, which caused it to escalate again. The system was arguing with itself, and it was winning. Oaks moved from console to console with increasing speed and decreasing effect. Every command he entered disappeared into the locked architecture like a stone dropped into water with no bottom. He was a ship's captain on a bridge where every instrument had gone dark and the helm had come free of the steering column. 40 years of training applied to a situation his training had never anticipated, and for the first time in his professional life, the gap between what he knew how to do and what the situation required was visible. Not just to him, to everyone watching him. Lieutenant Commander Sandra Oren, his senior systems officer, a 12-year veteran who had managed 3 significant network failures in her career and had managed them well, looked at her console and said something under her breath that was not a technical assessment. Oaks heard it. He did not reprimand her because she was correct. Near the secondary entrance, an ensign who had been at Cerberus for less than 4 months began moving toward the main door with the uncalibrated urgency of someone whose body had decided to leave before the mind finished its analysis. The door was reinforced naval-grade steel sealed by the same Protocol Omega that had locked every other system in the building. It did not open. 11 minutes. Daria Cross had not moved from the position where Oaks had released her arm. Her back was near the server rack bulkhead, her tablet in her right hand, her father's notebook still under her left arm. She was watching the room with the same quality of attention she had brought to it from the moment she arrived, comprehensive, analytical, the observation of someone taking inventory of a situation she had already modeled in her mind. Her breathing was even. 4 counts and a pause released slowly. Not a natural rhythm, a practiced one. The kind that does not come without years of deliberate maintenance. She looked at the secondary engineering terminal on the far side of the room. It occupied a corner that had not received anyone's attention in some time. The console was dark, not in standby, not in sleep mode, but genuinely offline. The power indicator, cold, the screen blank in the manner of something deliberately disconnected from the facility's main power distribution grid. There was a faint, settled layer of dust on the upper edge of the monitor housing. It was the kind of terminal that becomes invisible through disuse, that people stop registering as a terminal at all and begin registering simply as furniture, part of the unremarkable background of a room that has more urgent things to demand attention. She had designed it to look exactly that way. She crossed the command deck without haste, moving through the organized panic the way water moves through a gap in stone, not forcing, just finding the available path. Harlow saw her first. He was still at his console running override sequences that were not going to work, but some part of his attention had never fully left her, and when she moved, his eyes followed. She stopped in front of the dark terminal and set her tablet on the console surface beside it. She opened her father's notebook to a page near the back, a page dense with handwritten notation diagrams and a series of numbered sequences written in 2 colors of ink as if they had been added at different times, in different years, toward different purposes. She read something on that page for 4 seconds. Then she reached into a flat pocket along the left seam of her pullover and withdrew a short coiled cable, one end terminated in a connector type that Harlow did not immediately recognize. He crossed the room toward her because his body made the decision before his reasoning caught up. "Ma'am," he said, and then stopped, because he was 23 years old and 8 months from Annapolis, and he was about to tell a civilian not to touch a decommissioned terminal, and something in the quality of her focus made the sentence feel like the wrong sentence before he had finished forming it. That terminal has been offline since 2015, he said instead. It has been decommissioned. She looked at him. The gray eyes close up were not cold. They were the eyes of someone thinking about several things simultaneously who had long since stopped pretending otherwise. I know, she said. My father shut it down. He left one port open. She crouched and ran her hand along the lower edge of the terminal housing past the dust and the cold metal until her fingers found a small recessed panel unlabeled, indistinguishable from the surrounding surface, unless you knew it was there. She pressed it with her thumb. It clicked inward 2 millimeters. A maintenance port opened, the kind used for deep diagnostic access, the kind that bypassed the main power architecture entirely and drew from the facility's secondary circuit. The terminal came on, not with the full startup sequence of a system booting from cold, with the quiet, immediate presence of something that had been waiting. A single interface appeared on the screen, no icons, no navigation menus, no graphical layers. Just a command line with a blinking cursor, pale green against black, the visual grammar of computing from an earlier decade. The interface that could talk directly to the bones of the architecture beneath all the subsequent development. Harlow stared at the screen, then at the notebook, then at her hands as she plugged the cable into the maintenance port and connected the other end to her tablet. She began to type, not quickly, not with the frantic speed of someone trying to outrun a clock. With the deliberate pace of someone who knows that speed without precision is waste, that every keystroke has to land correctly on the first attempt because the margin for correction does not exist. The code appeared on the terminal screen, line by line building, something that Harlow watched with the growing and disorienting awareness that he did not recognize it. Not the syntax, not the structure. He was an Annapolis graduate in computer systems trained on the Cerberus architecture for 8 months, operating at a level appropriate to his rank and tenure, which was more than most of his peers and less than a very small number of people in the country. He did not recognize a single line of what she was writing. He leaned closer to the screen, and then he looked at the notebook at the handwritten sequences on the open page. The code on the screen matched the notebook, character for character. She was not composing from memory. She was translating handwriting into executable commands, moving text from paper to terminal with the confidence of someone reading aloud from a document in their first language. He looked at the notebook's inside front cover, which had shifted open slightly as she worked. In the upper left corner, written in permanent marker, the kind used to label equipment that goes to see 2 initials in a year. 2014, Warren Cross. 2014, 6 years ago, 2 years before he died. 1 year before he decommissioned this terminal and left the maintenance port open and wrote down in a notebook that he gave to his daughter the sequence of commands that would be needed to access the Cerberus system from its lowest architectural level in the event that everything above that level was locked by its own logic. He had known. He had seen the vulnerability, had reported, it had written the remediation proposal, and when the proposal was declined and filed and forgotten, he had done the only other thing available to him. He had left a key, not in the system which could be locked, not in official documentation which could be classified or lost or stamped with 4 red words and moved to the bottom of a queue, in a notebook, in his daughter's hands. 10 minutes. Oakes appeared at Harlow's shoulder. The captain's voice had shed the lower register that normally anchored it. What is she doing? He said. It was not quite a question. Get her away from that terminal. Harlow did not move. It was the first direct order from a superior officer that Ensign Beckett Harlow had ever failed to execute. He would examine that moment later, not with regret, but with the careful attention of someone identifying the exact point at which their understanding of themselves changed. He stood where he was between Oakes and Daria Cross, not blocking, not confronting, simply occupying the space. Oakes looked at him. Harlow looked back. 2 seconds of silence between them, which in the context of a room counting down from 10 minutes, was not nothing. Then Oakes looked past him at the screen. He looked at the code scrolling line by line across the terminal. He looked at the notebook. Something moved through his face that left it different on the other side, not broken but rearranged, the specific expression of a man watching his framework of understanding encounter something it was not built to accommodate. He took 1 step back. 9 minutes. Inside the arithmetic of what she was doing in the space between keystrokes, Daria Cross was aware of the room behind her. She was aware of the controlled escalation of panic of Orrin directing technicians through manual override attempts that were not going to succeed. She was aware of Harlow standing at her shoulder, quiet and still in a room that was neither. She was aware of a Tuesday morning in her first year at MIT, 7 a.m. Her mother's voice on the phone carrying the specific weight of a sentence being held together by effort. She was aware of a hospital room in August, air conditioning, too cold light from the window, the color of overexposed photographs. Her father's hand on her forearm, lighter than it should have been, the grip of a man conserving what remained. His eyes unchanged. Still the eyes of someone thinking about several things simultaneously, still present in a way that the rest of him was no longer fully managing. Promise me you will walk away from it. She remembered saying yes. She remembered meaning it. 8 minutes, she kept typing. She was not walking away from it. She understood that with the same settled precision with which she understood the code in front of her, not as a decision she was making, but as a recognition of what was already true. A person who walks away from a room with 40 people in it and a clock running from 8 minutes is not keeping a promise. They are making a different kind of mistake, one that does not have the same negotiable quality, one that cannot be examined later and understood and placed in the context of everything else the way a broken promise can. She thought of her mother. She thought of the phone call she would make tonight, the one that would not mention this room, this building, this terminal, this code, the one that would say, "I am okay," and mean it, and ask about the garden, about the azaleas that had been struggling all winter. The conversation that existed in the separate country of the life she was supposed to be living. She kept typing. On the main holographic display, something changed. A single thin filament of white appeared in the red static the way a flashlight beam cuts across smoke, not eliminating the dark, but establishing that it is not the whole story. Harlow saw it and let out a breath so controlled it was almost silent. The filament widened. The white line began to describe a shape, a circle imposed on the chaos growing outward from the center. As if the display were being redrawn from the middle, outward, the red static retreating before something that spoke the system's own language and said different things in it. 7 minutes, then 6. The synthesized voice cut off mid-sentence the way a broadcast cuts when the transmitter drops. The ensign near the sealed door stopped moving and stared at the overhead speaker as if he expected it to explain itself. 5 minutes. Oak stood very still. He watched the circle of white expanding through the red, watched it with the expression of a man whose carefully maintained understanding of what competence looks like is being revised in real time, and who is not yet certain whether the revision is survivable. He was not a man who revised easily. But the display was not asking his permission. The alarms went quiet one at a time, in each silence more startling than the last. The wailing primary tone stopped first, then the secondary pulse. Then the synthesized evacuation message cut off, leaving the word "recommended" hanging in the air for half a second before the room absorbed it. The emergency amber lighting cycled twice and then shifted back to operational white, clean and steady, the light of a room that expected to continue functioning. The holographic display cleared. The red static collapsed inward and dissolved, and in its place the naval engagement simulation reappeared. The contested ocean corridors, the carrier strike groups, the data streams in blue and gold, exactly as they had been 43 minutes ago, before everything had decided to come apart. The core coolant systems came back online with the sound of a large mechanical breath. The room stood in the silence that follows a very close thing. Not the silence of relief, not yet. The silence of people still calculating exactly how close it was and what that proximity means. Daria Cross unplugged the cable from the maintenance port. She called it once and returned it to the pocket in her pullover. She closed her father's notebook. She stood from the terminal and looked at the restored display for 3 seconds, confirming what she already knew, and then she turned and faced the room. 41 people, every one of them looking back at her. She looked at the primary command console, every indicator green. She looked at Harlow standing exactly where he had been standing throughout his expression, carrying the quality of someone trying to commit a moment to memory that will not require effort to keep. She looked at Oakes. He was looking at the notebook under her arm. Not at her face, not at the terminal, not at the display. At the notebook, at the leather and the cracked spine and the repair at its base. His face had completed its rearrangement. What remained was not shame. Shame implies surprise. And what Oakes was experiencing contained no surprise, only the slow and heavy recognition of something that had always been true, and that he had spent professional energy not knowing. The heavy door to the command deck opened with the release of pressure, the soft exhalation of reinforced steel unlocking as the system that had sealed it returned to its baseline state. Commodore Elias Dunmore walked in. He was 63 years old, compact with close-cropped silver hair, and a face that decades of naval service had organized into an expression of permanent, careful attention. He had been watching the command deck on the remote monitor in his office since the first alarm. He had watched the Cascade failure build. He had watched Oakes attempt to command a situation that would not be commanded. He had watched a woman in a gray pullover cross the room, open a terminal that had been dark for 5 years, and pull an institution back from the edge of catastrophe using a handwritten notebook and a cable she had been carrying in her pocket. He had spent several of those minutes very still. He walked across the command deck without looking at the displays, or the green indicators, or the restored holographic map. He walked toward Daria Cross with the deliberate economy of a man who knows exactly where he is going and has no motion to waste on the journey. He stopped 3 feet from her. He drew himself to attention. He raised his right hand in a salute that had nothing performative in it, nothing of ceremony or occasion. It was the salute of a man who had spent 4 decades understanding what the gesture actually meant, and was now using that meaning precisely, without ambiguity, without excess. "Ms. Cross," he said, "the facility is grateful you were here." He held the salute. Behind him, the command deck was very still. And Daria Cross, 26 years old, 4 years into a doctoral program she had promised her father she would finish, and come home from holding in both hands the notebook written in the dark early hours of a different decade, by a man she would not stop missing, gave a single nod. Not small, not dismissive. The nod of someone receiving something that belongs to someone else, carrying it forward. She looked at Oakes. He had not moved. He looked at the notebook, at the 4 red words he had stamped on her report 6 months ago, in the 30 seconds he had spent on it before moving to the next item in his queue. "Commodore," he began. Dunmore turned toward him. "Captain Oakes," he said, "you are relieved of command, effective immediately." The words were quiet and complete. Oakes opened his mouth and closed it, and in that silence made the most dignified decision of the morning, the decision not to argue, not to explain, not to offer context. He stood straight. He nodded once. Harlow watched Oakes walk toward the door, not escorted, just walking with the measured steps of a man maintaining his posture, because it is the last thing he has complete control over, and felt something he would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Not satisfaction, not pity, something more complicated than either. The particular feeling of watching a person encounter the actual boundary of themselves for the first time, which is always, regardless of who the person is, a kind of loss. The door closed behind Oakes. Dunmore turned back to the room and said in the same even voice that Lieutenant Commander Sandra Oren would assume interim command. Then he looked at Daria Cross and, without asking, stepped back to give her whatever space she needed. She needed the hallway. She walked through the command deck door into the corridor outside, where the air was several degrees warmer, and the fluorescent lighting was the unambiguous white of institutional infrastructure with nothing to prove. She walked until she reached a section of wall with nothing adjacent to it, just concrete and distance. She stood there. She opened the notebook to the inside back cover. 3 lines in her father's handwriting, written in a margin without explanation. The kind of note a man leaves himself when the thinking is moving faster than the formal record, and he does not want to lose it. If you are reading this in the field, the port is open. Use the sequence on page 47. Trust yourself. She had read those lines many times since August of 2016. In her apartment in Cambridge. At the airport on the way home for the holidays. On a train platform in Providence one afternoon, when she had taken the notebook out simply because she wanted to be near something of his. She had never read them in the field before. She stood in the corridor of LC-1 Cerberus for a while alone, long enough for her breathing to find its own rhythm without intervention, long enough to understand what she had done in the last 43 minutes and what it had cost and what could not now be undone. Then she took out her phone and called her mother. It rang twice. Her mother answered on the second ring with the particular alertness of a woman who had spent 30 years married to a man whose calls sometimes carried weight, who had never entirely stopped expecting the next one to carry weight too. "Hey, Mom," Daria said. Her voice was even. It was the voice she kept for conversations that existed in the other country, the one where dinner was a thing that happened and the garden needed attention, and Tuesday was just Tuesday. "I am okay. I am going to be home late." She listened to her mother say something about dinner. She said that sounded good. She looked at the wall, and then at the ceiling, and then at the notebook in her left hand. She had made her father a promise. She had kept it for 3.5 years. She had broken it in the only way it could honestly be broken, not from weakness, not from ambition, not because anyone had asked her to. Because the alternative was something that could not be undone, either just in a different way with different permanence. She kept that part to herself. She talked to her mother about azaleas until her mother's voice lost the alertness and became just her mother's voice, ordinary and warm, and located firmly in the country where things were manageable and her daughter came home for dinner. Then she said goodnight. She put the phone away. She stood in the corridor for one more moment alone with what the moment was. Then she went back to work. Part 3. The Ghost Walks the Bridge. She was still in the corridor when Herrick found her. He had not been sent. No one dispatched him, no one suggested it, and it would not have occurred to Dunmore or Orrin or anyone else managing the aftermath to think about the woman who had just saved the facility standing alone with her father's notebook. They had diagnostics to run, incident documentation to begin, careful phone calls to Naval Cyber Command to initiate before the story traveled through less official channels. They had a facility to put back in order. That was where their attention went. Herrick's attention went to the corridor. He walked through the command deck door and turned right without hesitation, which meant he had either seen which direction she went or had worked it out from the geometry of the building and the specific quality of what she would need, and with Doyle Herrick, it was genuinely difficult to know which. He found her 20 feet down the corridor, standing against the wall, phone back in her pocket, looking at nothing in particular. He stopped beside her, not in front of her. Beside her the way you stand beside someone when you are not there to talk at them, but simply to be present with them, which is a different thing and one that most people never learn. He was quiet for a moment. She was quiet too. The corridor hummed around them with the restored sound of the cooling systems, the deep, steady pulse of a building that had come back to itself. "Your father taught me something in 1994, Herrick said. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the wall. We were on a destroyer running night operations in the North Atlantic, and there was a failure in the secondary navigation array. Everyone who outranked him was working on the symptoms. He was the only one who went looking for the source. He sat on the deck plating for 2 hours with a diagnostic kit, and when he came back up, he did not explain what he had found or why it mattered. He simply fixed it and went back to his coffee." He paused, let the corridor hold the silence for a moment. "I have used what he showed me that night probably every week of my professional life since," he said. "The difference between working on a problem and working on what caused it, it is a simple distinction. Most people never make it." He turned and looked at her directly. He extended his right hand. Not a salute, not the formality of rank or institutional gesture. A handshake. Person to person across a distance that titles did not adequately span. She looked at his hand for one moment and then shook it. His grip was dry and certain. Hers matched it. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back toward the command deck without another word, and the absence of further comment was itself the statement, and they both understood it that way. The official inquiry began that afternoon. Dunmore ran it himself, which was not customary for an officer of his rank, and was a deliberate signal to everyone who understood how these processes worked. He sat at the head of the conference table in the secondary briefing room and moved through the timeline with methodical patience, the patience of someone who already knows what the record will show and wants it documented accurately regardless. The technical assessment came first. Lieutenant Commander Orrin led it, drawing on system logs that Cerberus had resumed generating the moment normal function was restored. The logs showed the cascade with clinical precision. The initial data packet from the Black Spear wargame scenario, the way it had matched Protocol Omega's threat parameters, the recursive loop that followed with each cycle compounding the previous one. The logs showed the facility had been 9 minutes from core thermal threshold when the intervention began. They showed the intervention itself as a sequence of commands entering from the decommissioned terminal's maintenance port. Commands the logs could record but not categorize because they arrived from outside any documented framework in the facility's official architecture. The commands would be classified above facility level within 2 weeks. The technical analysts assigned to examine them would spend 3 months on the work and still not fully account for why each one functioned exactly as intended, which would lead eventually to a recommendation that the foundational logic be incorporated into the facility's official remediation architecture, a process that would take 18 months and would reference in its classified appendix a handwritten notebook, last updated in 2016 by an officer who had not lived to see the problem he anticipated become real. Dunmore moved to the administrative record next. Going backward through the documentation was not comfortable for anyone in the room, and Dunmore did not attempt to make it so. The Vulnerability Assessment Report appeared in the record dated September 14, 2019, with the author notation D cross and the command review stamp that read non-priority in red and Oakes' signature below it. Dunmore read the executive summary aloud, 4 paragraphs. Precise, technically accurate, and correct in every particular. He set the report down and said nothing further about it. He did not editorialize. He did not analyze what it meant for a commander to have placed that stamp on a document authored by the daughter of the man who had designed the system the document was analyzing. He did not need to. The room contained experienced professionals whose analysis of that fact did not require his narration, and his silence on the subject carried more weight than any comment could have. Captain Garrett Oakes was formally relieved by order of Naval Cyber Command the following morning. The question of court-martial was considered and set aside a decision reflecting the institutional complexity of charging an officer for the downstream consequences of an administrative filing decision made in a context where non-priority designations were applied to hundreds of documents per quarter across the command. What was addressed separately through a process that was thorough and final was the physical contact documented in 7 witness statements from the command deck. He was reassigned to a logistics coordination role at a naval supply facility in the Nevada desert. He drove there on a Friday in late March with his household goods following in a moving truck, and the flatness of the landscape outside his windshield was so absolute and so different from every operational environment he had spent his career inhabiting that it felt at first like an imposed sensory deprivation. Sky too large, horizon too distant, nothing that required his command. The first night he ate alone and then sat on the back step of the temporary quarters and looked at the stars, which were clearer than he expected and provided no comfort, and thought about a gray Tuesday morning in Virginia and a woman with a notebook he had not stopped thinking about since he watched her walk back through the command deck door after the corridor call to her mother. He had looked up Warren Cross that night before the drive west. He read the full service record, which he should have read before accepting command of a facility Cross had designed. He found the vulnerability assessment report in the official archive, the original submission from 2015, that Cross himself had filed, the one that had received the same response from a different officer 4 years before Daria resubmitted it. The one that showed a man working in the last healthy years of his life, trying to protect something he would not live to see threatened. Oakes had sat with that for a long time. The thing about Garrett Oakes was that he did not lie to himself easily. His arrogance had always been the arrogance of genuine competence, the specific and most dangerous kind, the kind that is right often enough that it stops questioning itself. He had been correct about enough things for long enough that he had stopped maintaining the part of himself that checked. That was what had failed, not his intelligence, not his training, the maintenance. He began rebuilding it in the desert, slowly and at real cost, because the practices you abandoned for a decade require genuine effort to restart. He began asking questions before delivering conclusions. He began listening to the answer before constructing his response to it. He began noticing the people in his logistics facility who were quiet and precise and never announced themselves, the petty officer who could maneuver a 40-foot container through 2 inches of clearance on each side and had been doing it for 19 years. Without comment, the supply clerk, whose knowledge of the entire regional logistics network existed entirely in her memory and had saved 3 critical shipments in the past year without anyone filing a report about it. He began to see them. It was not fast, and it was not comfortable, and it did not announce itself with any ceremony. It was the private and incremental work of a person who has encountered the actual shape of his own limitation and decided for reasons unrelated to career or reputation or the opinion of anyone who would know to address it. He never forgot the notebook. He did not expect to. Daria Cross stayed at Dahlgren for 7 days. Dunmore had asked her to. The ask was direct. The facility needed a comprehensive architectural vulnerability assessment, and no one else qualified to provide it was available. She had looked at him for a moment and then said yes, and neither of them made more of it than that. She worked at the decommissioned terminal she had brought back online, which had been cleaned of dust and given a proper power connection and a chair at the appropriate height. She worked in the early mornings before the command deck populated and in the evenings after the day shift cleared. She worked from the notebook and from memory and from the quality of attention she brought to any system she had spent her life learning to understand, and over 7 days she produced a written assessment of Protocol Omega's core architecture that Orrin would later describe as the most technically thorough document she had encountered in 12 years of systems work. Daria did not consider that the primary work of the week. The primary work of the week was the conversations she had with Beckett Harlow. They were not lectures. She did not explain things at him. She sat at the terminal and he sat nearby. And when he was watching what she was doing, she would stop and ask him something. Not rhetorical questions, not questions designed to guide him to a predetermined answer. Genuine questions, open-ended, without fixed destinations. Why do you think this section of the architecture is structured this way? What would happen to the system's response time if you move this function to a different layer, if you were starting from the problem itself, not from this code base, but from what it is trying to solve, where would you begin? He answered carefully. He did not reach for what he thought she wanted to hear. He thought first and then said what he actually thought, and when he was wrong in ways that illuminated something which was more instructive than being right for reasons you could not fully account for. When he was correct, he could explain why, which was rarer and more important than the correctness itself. On the fourth morning, he asked her something. They were in the early hours, the command deck quiet around them, the overnight simulation running at reduced parameters across the holographic display. He had been studying a section of the foundational code, the original architecture, the sections Warren Cross had written before the subsequent development layers were placed on top of them. This code is different from the rest of it, he said. She waited. Not just technically different. He looked at the screen. When you read most code, you can see what the person who wrote it was solving. The logic, the path from problem to solution. This does that. But it does something else too. It feels like the person who wrote it was thinking about someone who would need to read it later. Someone who might need to understand not just what it does, but why it does it that way. He looked at her. My father believed that a system which cannot be understood by someone who did not build it will eventually fail when its builder is gone, she said. He wrote it to be read, not operated, understood. Harlow looked back at the screen. After a moment, that is not how most people think about this work. No, she said. It is not. He was quiet. Then, may I ask you something else? She nodded. Why do you keep the notebook? You have everything in it memorized. You could have digitized it years ago. She looked at the notebook resting on the console beside the terminal, the leather worn soft with years of handling the repaired spine, the pages dense with handwriting in two colors of ink. Because it is his handwriting, she said. The words are the same in any format. The handwriting is only in one place. Harlow did not respond. He turned back to the screen and studied the code for a while longer, and his expression had taken on the quality of someone who has just been shown something they will not be able to unsee. On the sixth evening, Dunmore came to the terminal. He sat in the extra chair that had been placed there over the course of the week, the chair that various members of the facility staff had occupied at various points, simply because proximity to what Daria was doing felt without anyone having articulated it like a form of education. He was alone. He had an envelope in his hands, not new, not official, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, the seal intact. He looked at it for a moment without opening it. I want to tell you something about the first time I saw your father work, he said. She waited. It was 1989. We were both at Annapolis, different departments, barely acquainted. There was a failure in the communications infrastructure, nothing approaching the scale of what happened here, but significant for the time and the technology. 6 people senior to him spent 3 hours addressing the symptoms. Warren Cross asked for 20 minutes alone with the documentation and then fixed it in 40. I was in the back of the room watching, and I thought that person is going to do something that matters. He paused. I was correct about that, he said. I was also correct that almost no one would know about it. That was the part I did not fully understand until I had known him longer. He did not want recognition, not because he was modest in the way people perform modesty, because he understood that the work was the point. The recognition was noise. The work was the signal. Daria looked at him steadily. He filed 3 reports about Protocol Omega, Dunmore said. Not 2, 3. The first was 2015, which you know. The second was 2016, 2 months before he died, which is also in the record. The third, he looked at the envelope in his hands. He asked me to submit after he was gone. He set the envelope on the console and opened it. The third report was dated August 29, 2016. 11 days after Warren Cross died. 7 pages, the most concise of the 3 he had been dictating. By then, the handwriting no longer reliable for extended work, and it contained not the full corrective sequence, but the logical framework that anyone with sufficient knowledge of the architecture could use to derive it. It had been classified above facility command level at the time of submission, which was why neither Oakes nor any of his predecessors had encountered it. It had been sitting in a classified archive for nearly 4 years, waiting for the moment it became relevant. He used his clearance access from his hospital bed, Dunmore said. 3 weeks before the end, he was making sure there was a record, that if the failure eventually occurred, there would be something pointing toward the solution. He trusted the system, she said, even after it had failed him twice. He trusted the record, Dunmore said. He understood the difference. Systems fail, records outlast them. She looked at her father's name on the author line. The official font of the typed document, because by late August of 2016, dictation was necessary, and someone she would learn later it had been Dunmore himself driving to the hospice on 2 consecutive evenings, had typed it while Warren Cross spoke the words. She put her hand flat on the page for a moment, just the weight of her palm on the paper. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of her pullover next to the coiled cable. There is one other thing, Dunmore said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a second envelope older than the first. The paper more yellowed, sealed with the kind of adhesive that has been holding for years and wants to keep holding. He set it on the console and stood. He believed it would become relevant, Dunmore said. He was correct about most things. He left without further explanation, which was she had come to understand over the course of the week, his particular form of profound respect, the refusal to narrate what the moment was already saying clearly enough. She looked at the envelope, her father's handwriting on the front. Not her name. 3 words for Beckett Harlow. She sat with it for a while with the weight of what it meant that her father had written a letter in 2015 addressed to a 23-year-old ensign he had never met and had trusted Dunmore to hold it until the right moment and had been correct that the right moment would eventually arrive. That the machinery of his thinking had been operating on timescales she was only now beginning to map. Then she picked it up and walked to the far end of the command deck where Harlow was running a diagnostic sequence, working with the steady precision that had developed over the course of the week, and she set the envelope beside his right hand without speaking. He looked at it. He looked at the name. He looked at her. She was already walking back toward her terminal. He opened it that night alone in his quarters, sitting at the small desk with the overhead light on and the window dark. It was a single page. Warren Cross had written it in September of 2015, the same month he filed his second Protocol Omega vulnerability report, the same month it was returned to him, marked non-priority in the blue-black ink of the specific pen brand he had used exclusively for 20 years. She would recognize the color later, when Harlow showed her, and the recognition would carry its own particular weight. The letter began without preamble. Ensign Harlow, it read, "You do not know who I am. By the time you read this, that may still be the case. My name is Warren Cross, and in September of 2015, I am a Rear Admiral with Naval Cyber Command, and you are 18 years old and in your first year at the Naval Academy, and I have never met you. I have, however, read your entrance examination materials, your academic record, and a technical assessment you completed as part of your application to the Academy's Advanced Systems curriculum. It was forwarded to me by an instructor who thought I should see it. She was correct. What you wrote demonstrated something that is genuinely difficult to teach. You did not simply solve the problem you were given. You examined why the problem existed, which is a different and harder question, and you worked from there. Most people do not arrive at that instinct without decades of failure first. That you arrived at some version of it at 18 means either you have found a shortcut I am not aware of, or you have had a teacher worth having. Neither explanation diminishes what the assessment showed. I am writing this letter because I am assigning you to a project. You will not know you have been assigned to it. The project is to become the person who can do what needs to be done when the systems we build are compromised by the assumptions of the people who operate them. That is not a project with a job description or a pay grade. Its only metric is simple. When the moment arrives, are you the person who stands at the terminal, or are you the person who tells someone else to step away from it? I believe I already know the answer. I am writing this so that you know I believe it. There was one more paragraph. My daughter's name is Daria. She is 22 years old and finishing her undergraduate degree at MIT and does not yet know she will follow this into the operational world, although she will. If she is part of whatever situation has made this letter relevant, there is something I need you to tell her. Tell her I read her 2019 report. She will know which one. Tell her it was correct in every technical particular and that I would have submitted it myself if I'd been given 4 more years. Tell her the port was always open because I knew she would eventually need it. Tell her the promise was real. The work was also real. Both things are true at the same time, and she should not spend another hour trying to choose between them. The next morning she was at the terminal when he came in. He set the letter on the console beside her without speaking. She picked it up and read it, and then she set it down and looked at the display for a while, the overnight simulation running its patient rehearsal across the holographic map, the carrier groups moving through their corridors, the data streams cycling in blue and gold. He would have submitted it himself, Harlow said. Yes, she said. He knew about the report before you filed it. He knew about the vulnerability before I was born, she said. He designed the system to carry both things at the same time, the flaw and the correction. He did not design the flaw out because he understood it would keep finding its way back in through the assumptions of the people who came after him. He designed the correction in, the maintenance port, the backup sequence, a way back to the foundation for someone who understood the foundation well enough to use it, because he knew the system would eventually be operated by people who did not understand it. He wrote Cerberus to be understood, she said, not just used. That is the difference between the foundational code and everything built on top of it. You saw it yesterday. You told me it felt like he was writing for a reader. He was. He was writing for the person who would be standing at that terminal when things went wrong. Harlow looked at the notebook on the console. He looked at it the way you look at something you have been circling for several days and are finally ready to approach directly. She picked it up. She turned it over once in her hands, the worn leather, the repaired spine, the pages that held 20 years of her father's thinking in two colors of ink. Then she set it on the console in front of Harlow. Read it, she said, not to memorize, to understand. There is a difference. He looked at her. I will need to return it, he said. Eventually, she said, not yet. She stood and picked up her tablet and her jacket. She had a car in the visitor lot, in a drive up I-95, in a dinner at her mother's house that she had promised before she left Cambridge and had come close to not making and was now going to make. She had a dissertation 4 months from completion and a terminal in the MIT Systems Lab that had been sitting idle for a week and that she was looking forward to returning to with the specific anticipatory feeling of going back to work that is genuinely yours work. No one assigned to you work you chose because it matters and for no other reason. She crossed the command deck toward the door. She passed the spot on the server rack bulkhead where Oakes had pressed her against the wall 8 days ago. Someone on the maintenance crew had placed a small square of blue painter's tape on the floor in front of it, placed there without authorization from anyone, without announcement, without explanation. The people who worked on this deck knew what it marked. It did not need a label. She paused. She stood in front of the server rack and looked at the bulkhead and then at the command deck around her, the displays running their simulations, the technicians at their consoles. Harlow opening the notebook at the terminal she had occupied for 7 days, the holographic fleet engagements cycling through their patient choreography, the deep resonant hum of the servers. 10,000 processors thinking in the cold blue light, the sound of the building her father had constructed in 14 months alone in the dark, with a space heater and a thermos of coffee that was always going cold. She put her right hand flat against the bulkhead. The steel was cool, faintly vibrating with the current of everything behind it. The servers, the cooling systems, the architecture her father had written across 14 months of solitary nights, the code he had designed to outlast him, to be understood by people he would never meet, to carry forward the thinking of a man who understood that the builder would not always be present. She held her palm there for a moment. Then she took her hand away and walked out. The plaque appeared 3 weeks later. No one has established with certainty who commissioned it or who installed it. It is a small thing, a 4x6 rectangle of brushed aluminum mounted at eye level on the server rack bulkhead, precisely at the spot the blue tape had marked, which was removed to accommodate it. The text is not a name or a title or an official designation. It is a single sentence set in the same font used for facility equipment labels, sized to be readable from arm's length and no farther. The system is only as strong as the person who understands it. Below the sentence in slightly smaller text, not operates, understands. The command deck crews at LC-11 Cerberus call the spot the corner. They have called it that since the plaque went up, and the name has not required any formal discussion or official designation because it does not need one. The people who were there understand it without explanation, and the people who arrived afterward learn it the way you learn most important things in institutional life, by watching what the people who know do when they pass it. What they do is this. For a major simulation before a significant systems exercise, sometimes simply at the start of an ordinary shift, with nothing particular scheduled, a technician or a junior officer will walk to the corner and stop. They will read the plaque which they have read many times before and could recite without looking. They will stand there for a few seconds in the hum of the servers, in the cold blue light, in the quiet presence of a building that has its own kind of memory. Then they will go back to work. It is not a ceremony. It is not a ritual with any formal name. It is what happens when a group of people have been in the same room for the same event and have arrived without coordination at the same understanding of what the event required and what it kept and what it is worth carrying forward. Ensign Beckett Harlow was promoted to lieutenant junior grade 14 months after the Tuesday in March. He did not campaign for it. He did not submit materials early or communicate to anyone in his chain of command that he believed the time had arrived. He continued doing the work, which was the only metric he had decided to care about. A decision arrived at across 7 mornings, watching someone apply that same standard without exception. He kept the notebook for 4 months. He read every page. Not to memorize, he had understood from the first day that memorization was not the point. He read it the way you read something that is trying to show you how a person thought, not what a person knew. He read the sections of pure code and the sections of half code, half annotation, the marginal notes written when the thinking had outrun the formal language and needed a different record. He read the pages clearly written at 3 in the morning when the handwriting was faster and less careful, and the pages written in the last year when the letters had become slightly larger and more deliberate, the pen pressed a fraction harder than necessary, the characteristic of someone who has been advised to rest but continues because the alternative is not acceptable. When he had read it through twice, he sent it back to Cambridge in a padded envelope with a note that said, "I think I understand why you kept it. The code is the same in any format. His handwriting is only in one place. Thank you." 3 weeks after that, he sat down at the secondary terminal, the corner terminal, the one with the maintenance port, and the pale green command line in the secondary circuit that bypassed the main architecture entirely, and he opened it the way she had shown him. Not with the sequences from the notebook, with the logic that the sequences implied. The foundational understanding of how a system is built to survive itself, to carry its own correction, to remain readable to the person who will need to read it when the builder is no longer present. He began to write. The code was his. It was built from everything Warren Cross had written, and everything Daria Cross had asked him, and everything he had worked through across 4 months of early mornings in LC1 Cerberus, when the facility was quiet and the thinking had room to develop without interference. It carried the inheritance without being the inheritance, the way a language carries the full weight of everyone who has ever spoken it without belonging to any single one of them. The notebook was not open on the console. He did not need it in front of him. What he needed, what she had given him across 7 mornings of genuine questions asked and genuinely answered, was already present in the way he approached the work. In the pause before each sequence, the brief return to first principles, the refusal to assume that what had been built before was necessarily the best path to what needed to be built now. He was not writing toward the notebook. He was writing toward what the notebook had pointed at, the thinking behind it, the standard it represented, the understanding that a system is only as strong as the person who understands it, not merely the person who operates it, and that understanding is built slowly through attention and questioning and the willingness to work from the foundation rather than from the surface. The cursor blinked on the screen. He typed. The holographic display above the command well ran the overnight simulation, the Pacific Corridor engagement, the carrier groups moving through their patient digital rehearsal for battles that no one hoped would be real. The servers hummed in the cold blue light. Outside, the Potomac was dark and the Dahlgren sky was full of stars. There were the same stars they had always been, indifferent and clear above the flat Virginia bank. The facility hummed its low continuous note into the night, the sound of controlled power. The sound of something built not to be permanent, but to be understood, built to pass its knowledge forward through the hands of people who had not yet been born when the first line of its code was written, who would carry it further than its builder could see, who would ask the right questions because someone had shown them in the specific and irreplaceable way that only demonstration can show what the right questions look like. The notebook was in Cambridge. The work continued.